once I get started, once I get started rambling, I'm fine. It's more the getting started that I don't do well with. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jack. I'm an amateur makeup artist and a huge book nerd. And today we're going to be talking about The House of My Mother by Shari Franke. It's a memoir about one of the children of the most notorious mommy blogger, Ruby Franke. And it's a lot. It was a very hard read for me, but I think it's important that we talk about it. So I'm going to list some trigger warnings on the screen. If you feel like anything could be triggering to you that we'll be discussing today, please feel free to click off. I will post another video that you can go watch. So yeah, let's get into it. So I have been keeping up with the Franke situation because I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so was Ruby, and so it was interesting for me to see a member of the church in the public eye the way that she's been in the public eye. And when Ruby was arrested, I watched the whole thing crumble, and it was, I don't want to say delightfully because it was horrible, but it was so fascinating to watch. I've been keeping up with all of the updates. I have been watching Swoop, who's an amazing documentary maker, and also Bose versus the World. They've been doing some really, really great in-depth deep dives into the Franke situation. I'm only going to give a short summary of, what's been going on, what happened. If you feel like you need more context to what I'm going to say, I would suggest going and watching either Swoop's docuseries or Bose's videos about the Franke situation, and then you'll be caught up to speed. My one complaint, and I don't want to say complaint just because, this book is a memoir of Shari, who's the oldest Franke child. So it's not really a complaint per se. You just have to have been following what's going on. If you're diving straight into this book with no prior knowledge of everything that's been happening, I think you're going to be a little lost. So basically, Ruby and Kevin Franke were the parents of the family blog that was titled 8 Passengers. So they had 6 children, and then Ruby and Kevin. And Ruby had always been in the public spotlight because she had a very authoritative style of parenting. So a lot of people watched her videos and they would be like, oh my gosh, these poor children. They're like, Ruby's horrible. I mean, I can't agree. I can agree. Ruby would threaten to cut the heads off of her daughter's dolls as punishment, which a child's toys are their friends. So threatening to decapitate one of their friends because they didn't do their chores, that's horrible. That's just downright horrible. I feel horribly for her children. Other notable things that Ruby Franke did to her children include taking away her oldest son's bedroom for 6 months and making him sleep on a beanbag in the basement, sending said same son to a wilderness camp for troubled teens, which, if you've been keeping up with Dr. Phil and The Ranch, you know how horrible that industry is. And, people were infuriated when she posted a video about one of her tiny daughters forgetting to pack lunch, and her daughter's teacher called Ruby and said, hey, I forget the name of the daughter, sorry, hey, your daughter forgot to pack lunch, could you bring her food? And Ruby's response to this was, no, she needs to bear the consequences of her actions, let's just let her go hungry. So, yeah, Ruby was a piece of work. My opinion is that she was a piece of work, respectfully. Actually disrespectfully, because we'll get into that. Anyways, so to make a long story short, after some wild things, Ruby started being involved in a group called Connections, which was very cult-like, under the direction of one Jody Hildebrand, who was the cult leader. And according to Shari's memoir, the bad things got worse. I don't think I'm allowed to say the A word on YouTube. We'll see. But yeah. So anyways, I keep going on and on. Long story even more short, Ruby and Jody were arrested for child false imprisonment and something else. They found her 2 youngest children with abrasions on their wrists and ankles, with honey and cayenne pepper slathered on them and the duct tape wrapped around the wounds. And the only reason that they were arrested was because the youngest boy, bless his heart, broke free and went to a neighbor's house to ask for food, and that neighbor called the cops. So, happy ending, the children were saved, and Ruby is in jail now with Jody. So, Shari basically, in her memoir, she doesn't mention any of her underage siblings. She only mentions Chad, who I believe was 18 at the time of publishing the book. She doesn't mention any of her younger siblings. She really only focuses on her experience, which I actually really like. She mentions in the book how her sibling's story is not her story to tell, and I find that incredibly mature of her. I find that makes me feel like she's not doing this for like clout or money. She's like literally just trying to put her story out there. Because if she really wanted to, she could have like exposed everything, like every little detail about what happened to her siblings, what they've been through, yada yada yada. But she chose not to. She kept it centered on her, which, I mean, it's her memoir, so that tracks. The writing style in this book was awesome. Shari is a great storyteller. She knows how to keep your attention. She's very good at explaining her emotions and how she feels about certain things. I finished the book in literally 2 days because of how like wrapped up I was in it. So, good job, Shari. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your memoir, and I really hope that you find peace one day. the reasons that this book was triggering for me was because I saw a lot of similarities between Ruby and my mother, who I don't speak with. Shari mentions towards the beginning of the book, she starts from when she can remember and goes all the way to Ruby's arrest. Shari says that when she was a younger child, she remembered thinking to herself, "Mommy isn't very nice to me." And then later, when she's like more like a preteen, young teenager, she says, "My mother doesn't love me." And that's like a revelation to her, which is so sad. It's so sad to hear that. I remember a time before my parents kicked me out when I started Googling, "Why doesn't my mother love me?" Because that's how I felt. I felt like my mother didn't love me, and I had no idea what to do about that. And it's so sad. It's so sad to think about the fact that Shari had the same feelings. Ruby didn't love her. Ruby only loved her because Ruby wanted to be a mom. And Shari was just an extension of Ruby. And that's kind of how it was with my mother, too. I was a cardboard cutout doll that my mom could dress up however she liked, mold however she liked. And that was that. Shari talks about how growing up her mother was volatile, how Ruby didn't like it when the attention wasn't on her, when that Ruby would sit Shari down in front of the piano at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m., an ungodly hour in the morning, and force Shari to practice. And if Shari made a mistake, Ruby would hit her. And it got to the point that if Ruby said that a piece was done and her piano teacher said that Shari needed more time on it, Shari would very quietly say, "My mom thinks it's ready." And then the piano teacher, who I think understood to a degree what was happening, would say, "Okay," and then sign it off so that Shari wouldn't get in trouble. My mother, while she didn't hit me, she didn't really allow me to follow music the way I wanted to. She had an old violin because she used to play violin when she was in high school. And when my middle school started doing like music exploration, so like getting into band, getting into orchestra, that kind of thing, and I told my mom that I wanted to play cello. And my mom said, "No, you're going to play a violin because we have a violin. And don't you want to play violin?" I used to play violin. And I was in 6th grade, and I was, desperate to, make my mom happy. So I was like, "Okay, yeah, sure, I'll play violin." And I played violin all through middle school and high school. Shari also talked about how Ruby would often keep order in the house with fear. Like I mentioned earlier, like threatening to cut the heads off of dolls. The children would lose the privilege of eating dinner if they did something wrong. Obviously, the fear of being hit if they did something wrong. And according to Shari, something that Ruby very often would say would be, "I'm your mother, not your friend." And that line stuck out to me a lot because that's something that my mother would always say. "Don't talk to me like that. I'm your mother, not your friend." I don't know if that's a respect thing or if personally, just my personal opinion, I think it's a respect thing. Where you will respect me because I am your mother. You will not speak to me in a familiar tone the way you speak to your friends because I am not your friend. I am your mother. And my mother would also say that she was an intentional parent, which means I have no idea. Don't have any idea what that means. If her parenting style was intentional, then she was intentionally not a good parent. Shari also said something interesting that I could relate to. Apparently in the Franke household, she wasn't allowed to have emotions. No one in the house was allowed to have emotions except for Ruby. So if Shari was crying, Ruby would be extremely dismissive. But if Ruby was crying about something, everyone was expected to shower her with empathy and love. And I am not going to lie, that was eerily similar to something that I remember from my childhood. Something that really sticks out to me. I think I was like 20, and I have depression and anxiety. And it was Christmas, and I always hated putting up the Christmas tree because somehow it just wasn't very fun with my parents. So I was kind of sitting on the couch not saying anything. And my mom legitimately looked at me and said, "If you're gonna be depressed, go do it elsewhere where I cannot see." Your daughter is depressed, and you just want her to go be depressed elsewhere where you cannot see her. Shari echoes that sentiment with Ruby, saying that no one is allowed to cry in the house unless it's Ruby. And I felt that. I felt that in my bones. It's very much a self-centered thing, I think. Or it's an emotionally immature thing. One of the two. Wow, this wing looks horrible. Give me a sec. I'll come back once I fix it. Well, one wing's bigger than the other, but I don't want to mess anything else up, so we're gonna keep going. So, thinking about everything that's going on with Shari, you might be wondering, well, where was her father in all of this? Was he absent? No, he was co-signing all of this. The way that Shari talks about her father is very similar to how I feel about my dad. And I know that I keep drawing comparisons, but like, I could not help it. I cannot help it. I feel so much pain. I feel so much of Shari's pain because I feel like I understand. I understand exactly how she feels, how it feels to have a mother who continually, like, treats you horribly, treats her like an extension of you, like you're not even a human being. And a father who co-signs it and, like, stands up for his wife at any given moment. Shari talks about how her father, like, her father would Shari talks about how her father often, supported his wife in whatever. He didn't try to stop her from doing things. He supported her in her blogging career. He didn't stop her from sending Chad away to a troubled teen center. He, he stood by her. And while I admire that devotion in both Kevin Franke and my father, it hurts. And I understand why Shari would be hurt. Because if you're watching the woman you love treat your children with such horrible, awful, just actions, I guess, is a good word. And you're not just ignoring it, you're supporting it. Yeah, that feels horrible. Because it, at least in my opinion, it feels like she has been chosen over me. And I'm not important enough to stand up for. Now, I will say that I was lucky in the fact that I can remember a few instances where my dad did stand up to my mom and he took my side. But it was very rare and very confusing when he did it, because it's not like what I was expecting. And even now, he stands up for her. I do keep in contact with my father. Even just this last Wednesday, I saw him because he wanted to give me back a box of things. And he asked me straight up if I was ever going to come back to the house. And I didn't say it to him. What I said out loud to him was, I don't know if I'm ever going to come back to the house. But I texted my partner and I was like, my dad asked if I'm ever going to come back to the house. And I wanted to say, does the bitchy demon still live there? And then no. Anyways, I digress. I'm sorry. This book, I have so many feelings. I have so many feelings. Anyways, back to Shari and Kevin. So Kevin didn't really stand up for his daughter. If you're familiar with the trial and like what happened right before Ruby got arrested, Kevin had basically gotten kicked out of the Franke home and was living by himself. Hadn't spoken to his younger children in like a year, which the fact that he didn't try, this is purely judgment based on what I know, and I could be completely wrong, so this is just my opinion. The fact that there's no evidence that he tried to find his children, that he didn't try to contact them in a year, his two younger children, shows his failings as a parent. That is just my opinion. Okay, so the last little bit that I want to talk about is Shari's critique of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So while Shari is going through all these horrible things with her parents, she is groomed by a 40-year-old man who is married. He is an active member of the church. He holds the priesthood, which is like a big thing in our church, where if you hold the priesthood, that means that you're worthy in the eyes of the Lord. You have certain power in the church. Very patriarchal. We'll get into that another day, I guess, if I ever feel like making a video on it. But she's groomed by this man. And the church, besides, not really do anything about the children's situation, the church punishes her when she comes to them about being essayed by this man. So instead of this man facing the consequences, Shari is forced to give up her temple recommend, which is something that's very special to a lot of members of the church. It allows us to go into the temple, and we have very sacred and spiritual experiences in the temple, and a lot of people treasure those moments. So to lose your temple recommend means you're losing access to those kind of moments. And the biggest thing for me, and for Shari actually, was that Shari didn't do anything wrong. She was literally essayed, and she was punished for it. And the man, nothing happened to him until a few years later, after Shari moved to a new congregation and went to the head of her congregation. And the head of her congregation, her new congregation, wasn't friends with the guy who essayed her, so he filed reports, and then the man who essayed her got punished. That makes me so angry. Another thing that Shari brings up, more in passing, was that she was diagnosed. She realized that she had religious OCD, which is basically making sure that you do everything appropriately so that you can be saved by God, which apparently is a real thing. I say apparently, I have had the same issues. And it makes me wonder, what part of the culture of the church, makes it so that young women have to deal with stuff like religious OCD, where, we are the ones responsible for making sure that we do not tempt the men of the church. We have to make sure that we do everything correctly, otherwise we're not going to get to heaven, and we're going to be damned. And it just makes me sad. It makes me sad to think about. I had really hoped that, maybe I was an isolated case. I really hope I still am. But hearing how similar Shari's experiences are to mine, it makes me sad. It makes me really sad. And I think there's a conversation to be had about the amount of power that men have in the church and the power difference between men and women in the church. Because men with no, this is going to sound really harsh, men with little to no emotional intelligence having responsibility over a congregation to give the congregation advice, to give the congregation counsel. That just seems like a bad idea to me. And, oh, that is not the color I was expecting. I actually kind of like that. Yeah, I actually really like that. Okay. Cool. So, as an example, when I was 12, I was in the youth program, and I was being bullied by not just the older girls, but I was also being bullied by one of the leaders. So I stopped going to my home congregation, or the congregation that I lived in the borders of, and I started going to another one. I would go to this other congregation, to their youth program, participate in it. Then I would come to my home congregation, sit through sacrament meeting, which is like the equivalent of like Mass in Catholic Church. And then I would sit through the second hour, which was normally when the youth program met, and I would sit with my mother in the library instead. Because I was trying to not be bullied. Like, I was 12. I didn't want to have to deal with that. So I remember I got called into the bishop's office. Sorry, that's what the leader of the congregation in the church is called. I got called into the bishop's office. And the bishop at the time told me that I was going to go to hell if I didn't stop going to a different congregation, and I needed to come home, back to my home congregation. And I just looked at him, because me being a very spiritual person now and at that time, I had prayed and I had received an answer from God that it would make my life better if I went to this other congregation instead. So for this man with no therapy training, very low emotional intelligence, I didn't like him, to tell me my salvation was on the line because I wasn't going to his congregation, that is way too much power. That is way too much power to be giving men like that, especially in a church that talks about having personal revelation and a personal relationship with God. Like, that is crazy to me. And I told him that at 12 to his face. I'm very proud of 12-year-old me for that. And that leads into, I think, my last thought. Shari and I have a very similar view on the church and, church authority. There's this beautiful quote, I will include it later, that she says, where she talks about how now that she's been through this experience, she values what God says to her more than what people say to her about what God wants. And I completely agree with that, because I have had church leaders who condoned my mother's behavior, who, would have reacted the same way that Shari's leaders did by taking away her temple recommend. I have seen an abuse of power in the church by men And so I agree with her. I think that it's more important to have a personal relationship with God and to believe in that relationship over whatever relationship a church leader says that you're supposed to have. And I'm on her side. I have more faith in God than I do in church and the church leaders. And that's perfectly fine, because humans are imperfect, but God is not. God is perfect. I feel like I should be like bearing my testimony or something, but this is not a church video. This book was difficult for me to read, but at the end of the day, I'm really, really glad that Shari got out of the situation she was in. I'm really glad that she wrote this book. As awful as it sounds, like, I found a little bit of comfort in knowing that I wasn't alone in my struggles. And there's so much hope in seeing how Shari is thriving now after everything she's been through. And I am incredibly proud of her. I am incredibly proud of how she worked to save her family, save her siblings, and to heal herself. We're going to be healing for a while, but you know what? I think that's okay. Anyways, that is the end of my thoughts. If you made it this far, please like the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.